Greetings, welcome, glad you came back. That poem today is so beautiful and so clever and so clean. I wish I could write like that. This sermon is not about that poem, but take a look at it with me as a way to think through the biblical readings we had today that we also tend to hate. First of all, if you don't notice the title of that poem and read through to the end and then go back and look at the title, there may be a kind of bewilderment. The verse is tender, the title crushing. Then we might realize that the poet never said what it was that he picked up, that delicate body. We assume it's a bird, but now we see maybe it wasn't. Maybe we see in his stillness, in his vulnerability, that he sees the miracle of his own being. Maybe this is a poem about resilience in moments after sudden impact. Maybe it is a broken heart or even a broken life that he picks up and holds in the palms of his hands. The poet has one word, divorce, that holds the weight of more pain and sorrow than any one of us can hold. And he pairs it then with verses about the miracle of healing that none of us can really wrap our minds around. He never tells us what or who the poem is about and does not need to. Because when we read that poem, we know who it's about because he or she speaks up within our own hearts or memories. Well, if we can just tiptoe like that up to Genesis and to Mark and disabuse ourselves of the presumption that we know what these verses are all about, we might just get something a little similar. First, let's see that there are two creation stories in Genesis, and this one we have for reading today is the second one. The first creation story comes to us before monotheism. It says that God created man and woman in our image, our being gods, plural, meaning the gods were male and female, or composed of masculine and feminine, or some other yin-yang kind of thing. It isn't quite explicit. But then there is the second story, the Adam and Eve story, that is not really about male and female, but rather about good and evil. And it's an explanation for how, in a creation that God declared as good, there came to be evil. You see, the ancient myth makers could not imagine that the God who created the software for life could have created it with a virus inside. How the heck did it get in there? Humans. The humans did it. Now, if we reverse the gender politics for a moment and say it was a woman whose rib from which man came to be created, it describes the very same thing. And if we're so bold as to read gender and sexual fluidity into this story and say it was a woman from whom another woman came to be, or any combination someone wants to fashion, the story tells us the same thing. In other words, if, like the poem, we don't know whose body the rib came from, or whose life came from the rib's marrow, then from our own histories of pain, vulnerability, and loss, we know who it's about. Human beings, you see, are not solitary creatures. That's the punchline. We cannot live well or in health if we're alone and disconnected from a community of others. That does not mean that we're unable to live without a partner or children or blood family members, but rather that like trees and ferns and fungi, our roots need to be intertwined and interconnected with other human beings somehow. The poetry of both Genesis stories tell us in the language and images of ancient mythology that we were created as interdependent creatures who need others in order to thrive. Now I could, as I've done in past sermons, spend a lot of time dissecting Mark's story about Jesus' teaching on divorce, but I'm more interested today in its poetry rather than its prose. Jesus quotes the first creation story as his reference point. God created them male and female. God created us as both, each with some of each in varying degrees of content by volume. Any human being that does not contain some element of each gender is a human to be feared. It would be a monstrous freak of nature because, we are both. And then Jesus confirms what both creation stories affirm, that we cannot be separated. Our union cannot be eliminated by the horrid butchery committed by Hamas, nor the inhumane onslaught rendered by Israel. Palestinian and Israeli, they're one, inseparable. No act of violence, segregation or hatred can disconnect the connection and interdependence that exists between human beings. Regardless of the MAGA hatred spewed at rallies and regaled on the roadside, or the shaming and fear-mongering heaped upon them by the left, we are one, inseparable. Whatever we do to the other, we're doing to ourselves. There is no divorce possible for a species created with biological, spiritual, and psychic interdependence. We can violently segregate ourselves and coldly deny one another, the presence of one another within and around ourselves, but we cannot divorce the other from who we are. Cut off the arm or cut off the leg, and the phantom is still there. What God has joined together, no one can put asunder. This is why we're in such horrible shape as a species and a planet. We fail to recognize our interdependence with one another. We fail to recognize our interdependence with other species, whether mosquitoes, worms, or crows. We cannot, we imagine that we imagine that we can divorce ourselves from the other life forms around us we do not like or that make us uncomfortable. But we cannot divorce ourselves without harming ourselves. We all live on a planet with a thin atmosphere and with streams, rivers, aquifers, lakes, and oceans that run into one another. We all live in a Garden of Eden designed as a giant ecosystem in which soil biology and plant photosynthesis and the balance of predator and prey are all interconnected and cannot be divorced without doing harm to each constituent part. Human beings have come to imagine that we're not part of nature, but somehow independent of it. This is intellectual violence that has led to actual human violence against the ecosystem in which we are woven. And thus, hazardous green algae and barren soil and even raging storms that bring horrendous floods. I understand the difficult and painful history of Genesis and Mark when it comes to the gender politics of these stories. But none of that is what these stories are about. We have to ignore and rip out by the roots the poetry of the text in order to misuse them the way they have been misused. The rib, the divorce, are not about patriarchy. They're about us, all of us, and how we cannot be separated. What God has joined together, no one can separate without doing violence even to themselves. Thanks again for being here. I wish you peace.